We're now ready to begin our discussion on our final type of clause and our final type of sentence that we need to present before all the different types of clauses and sentences have been covered. Let's start with adjective clauses. An adjective clause is a dependent clause. Remember, that means it's a group of words that cannot stand by itself, and it adds detail or information to a noun or a pronoun in the sentence. So it helps describe more about potentially the subject of that sentence. An adjective clause usually follows right after the word or words that is adding to, and it tells us as the reader which one is being discussed or what kind is being discussed. I feel like adjective clauses are maybe the easier of the two dependent clauses to try and figure out and identify because they begin with one of five relative pronouns, words that we call in this group. If you see these five words, that means that clause is an adjective clause because it begins with one of these relative pronouns. Those words are that, which, who, whom, and whose. Again, as the beginning of a dependent clause, an adjective clause that tells us which one and is talking about the noun or pronoun in the sentence. When we look at this example, Emma Willard was the one who founded the first women's college in the United States. There's a couple of ways to get to the answer. The first one is maybe you find the subject of this sentence, and then you find the verb, and you know that the subject and verb cannot be part of the dependent or adjective clause. So in this sentence, we say Emma Willard is the subject. That is who the sentence is about. And the verb that goes with the subject is was. It's a linking verb. Emma Willard was the one. If you consider that as our independent clause and you keep in mind the relative pronoun discussion we just had, then you would come up with who founded the first women's college in the United States. There's your adjective clause. It begins with the relative pronoun who, and this adjective clause modifies or tells more about the one. Emma Willard was the one. Which one? Well, the one who founded the first women's college in the United States. Our second example here, I want a bicycle that I can ride over rough ground. Subject is I, verb is want, and the direct object here is bicycle. So I want bicycle is part of the independent clause. That, again, combined with the information about relative pronouns, we see the word that here. The word that begins our dependent or adjective clause. So that I can ride over rough ground is an adjective clause that describes the noun right before it, which is bicycle. I want a bicycle. What kind of bicycle do you want? I want a bicycle that I can ride over rough ground. Relative pronouns begin adjective clauses as relative pronouns. That, which, who, whom, and whose. You see those? It's an adjective clause. Now let's look at some compound complex sentences that may include an adjective clause in them. These are the most lengthy sentences that we're going to encounter in the discussions we've been having because when you look at the name of the sentence, compound complex, you know it's going to have a compound sentence in it, which is two independent clauses at least, and a complex clause or a complex sentence which is an independent clause and a dependent clause. So there's a lot of words going on in a sentence like this. A compound complex sentence contains two or more independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. So it could have at least three, if not more, clauses within the same sentence. Here's an example. The band began to play, and Clarissa was pulled onto the dance floor for a dance that was starting. The first thing we want to do is we want to use that comma. All through this process, we've said use the comma to decide what the clause is right before or right after the comma. So when you read the clause that comes before the comma and you're deciding is it dependent or independent, looking at that phrase and the way it's written, you would say that that first clause is an independent clause. So we would underline it once. Then we have the word and. That's a conjunction word. It combines or connects clauses within a sentence. So here's our compound sentence. The band began to play, which is an independent clause. And then we've got another one. Clarissa was pulled onto the dance floor. Then we come to this last phrase, for a dance that was starting. It doesn't begin with that, which, who, whom, or whose. So we know it's an adverb clause. We also know that it answers the question, why? Clarissa's pulled on the dance floor. Why was she pulled onto the dance floor? Well, for a dance that was starting. So we underline the dependent clause twice. The last thing we want to do now is go back and find the subjects and verbs of each of the independent clauses. The band began to play. So the subject in that first independent clause is band. That is who that independent clause is about. And what did they do? Began. The band began. They could do many things after that, but began is the verb. Then we've got to find the subject and the verb or verbs in the second independent clause. Well, the second one is Clarissa. That is who the independent clause is about. And the verb or verbs that goes with that subject is, well, there's two. There's was, which is a helping verb, and pulled, which is an action verb. So we have done all we need to do here. We found our two independent clauses, our dependent clause, and our subjects and verbs in this example. Next example, the Grand Canyon is a stunning sight, but Yosemite National Park also has many impressive features that you will never forget. Step one, find our first independent clause. Our first independent clause here, the Grand Canyon is a stunning sight. We've got our conjunction word then, the word but, that comma right before it. And then following that, we have our second independent clause, which is Yosemite National Park also has many impressive features. Which brings us to the very end. In order for it to be compound complex, we've got to have that subordinate, that dependent clause that cannot stand by itself. And we would double underline the dependent clause that you will never forget. So we've got an independent clause, and a dependent clause at the end, and that type of clause is a adjective clause because it begins with the word that. Last thing we got to do here, we got to find our subjects and verbs. The subject of the first independent clause we've got here is Grand Canyon, what the sentence or what the clause is about. The verb that goes with that is the word is. It's a linking verb. Grand Canyon subject is the verb It's a site. Grand Canyon is site. Then we look after the comma, after the conjunction word, and our subject here is 3 words: Yosemite National Park. They have to go together. Okay? They have to go together. Our verbs here is has. What does it have? It has impressive features. So there's our 2 independent clauses, our 1 dependent clause, and subjects and verbs in each one. Another example, you can take a large cruise ship to see the glaciers of Alaska, or you can ride a smaller boat that can go closer to the coast and its icy covering. Step 1, find the first independent clause. That first independent clause, you can take a large cruise ship to see the glaciers of Alaska. It's followed by the comma, the conjunction word or, and then another clause right after that word or, which is another independent clause. So we underline it once. You can ride a smaller boat. That's independent, makes sense by itself. And then what you're left with, once again, is another dependent clause here that begins with the word that. That can go closer to the coast and its icy covering. And this dependent clause, when you think about the 2 we've talked about, is an adjective clause. It begins with the word that. So we go back, we find our subjects and verbs. Subject in the first independent clause, who or what this independent clause is about. You and what you're doing. We have a verb phrase here, which means we have 2 verbs working together, and that would be can and take. And then we look after the conjunction. You can ride in a smaller boat. Our subject, once again, just like the first one, is you, and the verbs that go along with it, can ride, a verb phrase, a helping verb, and an action verb. Compound complex sentence with an adjective clause. Next example, we must hurry so that our applications are turned in on time. Otherwise, we may not be chosen for the leadership program. So our first independent clause here is we must hurry. Then we've got a adverb clause. We would underline it twice because it begins with the phrase so that. We must hurry. Why must we hurry? So that our application is turned in on time. We don't have a conjunction word here. We actually have the semicolon replacing it. And then afterwards, we have another independent clause. So this dependent clause was right in the middle of the sentence. Now we go back and find our subjects and verbs. In the first one, the subject is we. And then the verb, there's actually 2, must hurry, a helping verb and an action verb. Then we get into the final independent clause that's got subject, and it's actually have multiple verbs in it. The subject here is we. And then we have not 1, not 2, but 3 words that would be considered verbs for this independent clause. Those 3 words are may, be, and chosen. 2 helping verbs and an action verb. May and be are helping, and chosen is your action verb. So in compound complex sentences, you've got at least 2 independent clauses. You have to, because to get the compound part of this. And the complex, you have to have at least 1 dependent clause, either adjective clause or adverb clause, to make it a compound complex sentence.